It is a profoundly moving statement of our values, and it has never been more relevant than it is now. The room was closed before sunrise. The phones were left outside, and the family name was spoken like a warning. What began as a private estate meeting became the moment King Charles made a decision no one expected. The Sussex Trust Fund would no longer flow toward Harry and Meghan's household. Instead, it would be redirected toward William's children, quietly shifting money, power, and royal protection in one devastating stroke. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles did not rush the file. He sat with it in front of him as though the paper had become heavier than any crown he had worn. The Sussex Trust Fund, a private pool of family-linked money meant to support Harry and Meghan's branch, had once looked like a bridge. Now, the king treated it like a risk. A private estate meeting means a closed family discussion about property, money, and inheritance, and this one had been arranged away from cameras, aides, and any voice that might soften the blow. He knew exactly what he was doing. The money would be redirected to Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, placing William's children at the center. William received the news with a silence that did not feel like victory. The prince understood why his children mattered because George carried the shadow of a crown, Charlotte carried the strength of change, and Louis carried the innocence everyone wanted shielded. But he also knew what this meant for Harry. His brother's place had not simply been reduced, it had been measured and moved aside. William kept his face still, yet the future king felt the ache beneath the decision. Protection for his own children had arrived wrapped in pain. Charles finally lifted the sealed estate note and read the phrase that changed the room. Future safeguarding. The words sounded calm, but they landed like a verdict. Future safeguarding meant protecting the next generation before private conflict could threaten royal stability. And the king understood how cold that explanation would sound. Still, he signed because the note contained a clause allowing redirection under extraordinary family circumstances. The monarch did not smile. He placed the pen down slowly, as if setting down hope between himself and his younger son. The first shock was not the money, it was the witness list. Camilla had been present. William had been present. And one senior estate advisor had watched Charles sign the instruction without flinching. Once those names were known, the decision stopped looking like paperwork and began looking like a family reckoning. At the heart of the decision were three children who had never asked to become symbols of the monarchy's future. George, Charlotte, and Louis were not in the room, yet their names carried more weight than anyone else's. Charles looked at William and understood that this was not simply about inheritance, it was about who would be protected, who would be trusted, and who would be written into the next chapter. William felt the weight before a single signature touched the page. The prince knew why George mattered, why Charlotte mattered, why Louis mattered because they were not just children inside a famous family, they were the direct future of the crown. The crown means the royal role and authority that passes from one generation to the next, and that made their security, education, and public life more than private concerns. Their protection shaped the whole estate plan, which meant the family's money and property were being arranged around the monarchy's survival. Charles had once treated the Sussex Trust as a bridge. The king had hoped it would keep Harry's family connected even after the distance, the interviews, the anger, and the years of public wounds. A trust fund is money set aside for specific people under controlled rules, and this one had once carried a quiet message. There was still a place, still a line, still a possible return. But now that same bridge had been turned away from Harry, and the monarch knew exactly how cruel that would feel. Catherine saw the conflict in William before anyone else did. She steadied the prince with a few quiet words before the meeting. Not because he was weak, but because he understood too much. Protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis meant accepting a decision that would make Harry feel smaller inside the family. Catherine knew the children needed safety, but she also knew safety had arrived with sorrow attached. She carried that truth quietly, and the future king carried it with her. Charles asked for the children's names to be read aloud before he signed. George, Charlotte, Louis. Each name changed the air. The king did not ask for Harry's name to be repeated after the redirection clause was confirmed, and Camilla noticed it instantly. The queen consort kept her eyes on him, sensing that the silence around the younger son had become part of the decision itself. She understood the wound before anyone said it out loud. Camilla did not interrupt. She watched Charles hold the pen, watched William lower his eyes, and watched the family choose protection over repair. The money mattered, yes, but the meaning mattered more. This was no longer just support being moved from one branch to another. This was the monarchy admitting which future it trusted most. The structural finality of that morning did not emerge from a vacuum, nor did the trust change direction overnight. The institutional shift had been gathering momentum for months, tracing back to a pivotal confrontation that fractured the family's remaining consensus long before the first document was drafted. The structural finality of that morning did not emerge from a vacuum, nor did the trust change direction overnight. The institutional shift had been gathering momentum for months, tracing back to a pivotal confrontation that fractured the family's remaining consensus long before the first document was drafted. To understand the cold precision of the redirection clause, the timeline must be rolled back to a private dinner at Clarence House that began with polite conversation and ended with a silence so sharp it stayed permanently inside palace walls. No announcement followed that evening. No public statement admitted anything historic had occurred. But those who were present remembered the exact moment the trajectory of the Windsor estate fundamentally changed. Harry had arrived at Clarence House carrying more than frustration. He carried years of feeling pushed away, years of believing that every door opened automatically for William but closed slowly and deliberately for him. Clarence House is a royal residence in London often used for private family meetings, and on that specific night, it became the high-stakes arena where family finances, children's security, and future financial support were placed directly on the table. The gathering was formally noted as the April Settlement Dinner, a private attempt by the king to settle whether the Sussex household would continue receiving estate-linked support from the family's wider financial structure. Charles sat at the head of the table, listening patiently while Harry pressed for concrete guarantees. The Duke wanted written financial protection for his household, and he demanded it without palace control. That single phrase changed everything. Palace control represents the family's internal rules, approvals, and strict limits over money, security, and public conduct. By demanding his support be permanently separated from that oversight system, Harry was asking to remain funded by the crown while standing entirely beyond its reach. The king looked deeply pained. He did not hear a standard request for a son's inheritance. He heard an ultimatum that threatened the structural integrity of the institution. Harry felt cornered by the lack of immediate compliance, while Charles felt deeply wounded by the lack of institutional trust. Neither man said the deepest truth out loud, leaving the heavy lifting to the future heir. William answered slowly, his voice dropping to a level that signaled he would not bend under pressure. He told Harry directly that the crown could not keep funding uncertainty while George, Charlotte, and Louis carried the absolute burden of institutional continuity. The crown means the royal authority and future line that must be protected for the monarchy to survive, and William knew his children were already living under that permanent shadow. Harry heard judgment and exclusion in those words, but the future king meant raw responsibility. The brothers were speaking the same language of protection, but their individual pain translated it entirely differently. Charles set down his glass when Harry repeated the demand for unconditional protection outside palace control. The sound of crystal hitting the table was small, but the institutional meaning was final. The king did not shout, nor did he accuse his younger son. He simply ended the discussion right then and there, and that quiet ending became the official point of no return. William watched his father's face change from a parent seeking reconciliation to a monarch executing a duty. Harry saw the door close before anyone touched the handle. Immediately following the conclusion of the dinner, a senior estate advisor wrote the very first version of the redirection clause. An estate advisor is a private legal and financial expert who helps manage royal family property, trusts, and inheritance decisions, and this advisor recorded the core rationale in a documented internal account. Future support could not become a financial weapon utilized inside the family. Charles did not reveal this administrative shift publicly. He allowed a heavy layer of silence to cover the legal drafting. But that silence did not erase the reality of what was coming. The April settlement dinner was the spark, but the confrontation that followed turned the spark into a full-scale family fire. The mechanism of execution was now fully set in motion, and it would ensure that Harry would not hear about his new financial reality from a public headline, but through a direct communication that would sever the remaining ties between London and Montecito. The mechanism of execution was now fully set in motion, and it would ensure that Harry would not hear about his new financial reality from a public headline, but through a direct communication that would sever the remaining ties between London and Montecito. He heard it in a private call that left him standing completely still, one hand pressed hard against the table, as if the floor had physically shifted beneath him. The message was simple, direct, and final. The trust had been redirected. His father had chosen William's children. And for the first time, Harry understood that this was no longer a matter of tactical distance. This was total separation. Harry listened in absolute silence as the palace communication was read in a careful, unyielding voice that made every word feel colder. A controlled palace communication means an official private message prepared by senior royal staff to deliver sensitive family news without emotion, debate, or room for negotiation, and this one carried no comfort whatsoever. The estate instruction had been finalized. The trust was no longer meant for the Sussex household. The Duke heard the stark meaning beneath the legal language. His institutional place had been permanently reduced, and the family had executed the change before he could even mount an argument. Meghan stood near him when the message arrived, and she understood the institutional damage instantly. The Duchess did not treat it as a simple money matter, because money inside a royal family is never only money. It signals trust, it signals status, it signals whether a household is still protected by the inner circle or quietly but firmly placed outside it. Meghan told Harry directly that this was not a private adjustment. She warned him it was a public humiliation waiting to happen, and the Duke knew her assessment was entirely accurate. Harry felt betrayed by Charles in a way that surprised even him. The king had disappointed him before, wounded him before, and stayed silent during previous crises, but this felt entirely different. This felt like a definitive verdict on his loyalty. Harry did not only think of the lost trust, he thought of the April settlement dinner, the warning in William's voice, and the precise moment his father had set down his glass instead of reaching out to him. The old pain came back sharper because now it had an official signature attached to it. Meghan pushed him to challenge the decision immediately. She told the Duke to demand names, demand specific reasons, and demand the identity of the person who had authorized the final move. But Harry hesitated, and that hesitation revealed the deeper, more vulnerable wound. He feared the answer. He feared hearing that Charles had not been pressured by advisors, had not been misled by staff, and had not been cornered by circumstances, but had chosen this outcome with a clear and deliberate mind. Meghan saw that fear in him, and for once, her anger could not cover his silence. Breaking that silence, Harry demanded a direct conversation with William, and the brothers spoke without aides for the first time in months. Aides are royal staff members who manage schedules, screen messages, and handle private arrangements. But this time there was no one present to soften the words or de-escalate the tension. William told Harry directly that the decision was entirely about protecting the next generation, not humiliating him. The prince said George, Charlotte, and Louis carried a future that could not be exposed to ongoing family uncertainty. Harry heard protection, but he also heard absolute exclusion. William did not raise his voice. Harry did. The future king stayed entirely controlled because he knew every sentence uttered in anger could become another irreversible fracture. The Duke pressed his brother on whether he had personally asked for the trust to be redirected, and William answered with a painful, steady calm. He told Harry that he had accepted the long-term responsibility, but the final authority had come directly from their father. That answer did not cool Harry's anger. It redirected it entirely. The brothers had spoken, but the real force behind the decision was still hidden behind state law, family duty, and one king's trembling signature. The brothers had spoken, but the real force behind the decision was still hidden behind state law, family duty, and one king's trembling signature. Power inside a monarchy rarely announces itself loudly. It appears in a file placed on a desk, a pen uncapped in silence, and a monarch asking one final question before history moves forward. Charles had the supreme authority, but that authority did not make the choice any easier. As the senior estate advisor explained the operational mechanics of the clause, the king stared at the page like it had become a mirror of every failure he could not undo. Charles understood the clause before the advisor even finished reading the text. An estate clause is a written rule inside a family financial document that explains exactly when money, property, or benefits can be changed and this specific one gave the monarch room to act if the crown's long-term stability required it. The crown's stability meant the survival of the royal line, the public trust around it, and the protection of the children expected to carry it forward. That was precisely why the decision mattered. It was not just about Harry losing support. It was about George, Charlotte, and Louis being explicitly named as protected beneficiaries. Camilla watched Charles closely and saw something colder than anger. The queen consort saw exhaustion, she saw sadness, and she saw a man who had spent years trying to keep a door open, only to decide that the door itself had become dangerous. The king knew the action would deepen Harry's sense of exile, and that knowledge sat heavily on him. He was not simply cutting a name from a page, he was admitting that trust, once broken inside a family, could become completely impossible to manage. The senior advisor confirmed the justification in a documented estate account prepared specifically for the meeting. The clause had not been activated because of one bad headline or one angry interview. It had been activated after the April settlement dinner shattered the remaining confidence inside the family. An estate account is a private written record used to explain why a major financial instruction was made, and this account made the logic painfully clear. Future support could not be left where it might one day be pulled into conflict. Charles read the private phrase written near the lower edge of the document. The line must be secured before the wound spreads. He did not say it loudly. He repeated it almost as if he was testing whether the words belonged to him. The king knew the line meant William's children, the direct future of the monarchy. He also knew the wound meant Harry, Meghan, and the pain nobody in the family had managed to heal. That sentence turned the decision from policy into confession. Camilla stayed silent as Charles signed. The queen consort realized he was not acting with triumph, and that made the moment worse. Anger would have been easier to understand. Revenge would have been easier to condemn. But this was final resolve dressed in sorrow, and that made it harder to fight. The pen touched the page, and the room changed. The ink had barely dried when the first emotional consequence appeared, not in an official statement, but on Camilla's face. Camilla had seen royal decisions before, but this one carried a different kind of silence. When the door closed behind the advisors, she remained seated, staring at the empty chair where Charles had been moments earlier. The queen consort understood what others would not. This was not only a financial redirection, it was a father admitting that love had failed to keep the family whole. Camilla did not move when the first aide returned with the prepared language. The queen consort heard the careful words being shaped for any possible leak. And each phrase sounded smaller than the truth. Aides are royal staff members who manage messages, schedules, and private instructions, and now they were trying to turn family pain into controlled language. The household knew why it mattered. If the redirection became public, people would not see a technical estate decision. They would see Charles choosing one son's future over another son's place. Charles withdrew almost immediately after signing. The king refused lunch, asked for no calls, and requested time alone before speaking to William again. His silence frightened Camilla more than anger would have, because anger burns quickly, but regret stays. The monarch understood that the decision affected more than money. It touched public rank, emotional standing, and future family access. Harry would not simply hear that the trust had changed. He would hear that his father had moved him further from the center. Camilla worried Harry would mistake protection for rejection. She knew the Duke would feel the blow before he understood the reasoning, and perhaps he would never accept the reasoning at all. The queen consort had watched Charles carry this burden with a tired face and a steady hand, and she knew the king had not signed to punish. He had signed because he believed the crown could not survive another open wound around its future children. One aide noticed the Sussex file being moved from the active estate cabinet to a restricted archive drawer. An archive drawer is a protected storage place for sensitive records that are no longer handled as open working files, and that small movement carried a brutal message. The Sussex matter was no longer being treated as active support. It was being treated as closed history with limited access. The aide said nothing, but silence inside the palace often speaks louder than statements. Catherine received her own warning quietly. She was told the children would be shielded from the details, yet she immediately thought of George. The princess understood that one day he might learn his name had been read aloud while Harry's support was redirected. She wanted the children protected, but not hardened. She wanted them safe, but not raised on a victory built from family loss. The palace could manage documents and language, but it could not manage what passed between father and son behind a closed door. When William entered the room, Charles was no longer standing behind a desk. He was seated near the window, hands folded, looking older than the title he carried. There were no advisors, no Camilla, no Catherine, no papers between them, only a father and a son, facing the cost of a decision that protected 3 children while confirming the fracture of another. When William entered the room, Charles was no longer standing behind a desk. He was seated near the window, hands folded, looking older than the title he carried. There were no advisors, no Camilla, no Catherine, no papers between them, only a father and a son facing the cost of a decision that protected 3 children while confirming the fracture of another. Charles had requested the meeting himself. The king did not want a constitutional briefing, not this time. A constitutional briefing means a formal discussion about royal duty, public role, and the future structure of the monarchy. But this meeting was not about polished language or careful procedure. It was about a father explaining why he had made a painful choice. He looked at William and knew the prince deserved the truth before the world twisted it into something simpler, colder, and easier to attack. William did not sit like a man who had won. The future king carried the decision heavily because George, Charlotte, and Louis were now protected in a way that would be impossible to ignore. Their names had become part of the estate instruction, and that mattered because those children represented the direct line of the monarchy. The line means the order of family members expected to inherit royal duty, and Charles believed that line had to be secured before family conflict reached it. Still, the prince knew security had arrived with a shadow. Charles told William he had not redirected the trust to reward him. The monarch said it slowly, as if he needed his son to believe every word. He had done it to protect the children from future instability, from arguments that could one day reach their schooling, their security, and their public lives. The king admitted the April settlement dinner had changed him. That dinner convinced him that estate support could become a weapon inside the family if it remained tied to unresolved anger. William listened without interrupting. The prince finally said he never wanted his children's safety to come at Harry's expense. He knew the duke would feel replaced, and that thought troubled him more than he wanted to show. The future king promised Charles that George, Charlotte, and Louis would never be taught to celebrate what Harry had lost. They would be taught duty, not triumph, protection, not pride, continuity, not cruelty. Charles lowered his eyes when William said that. The king heard mercy in his son's answer, and for a moment the decision felt less like a wound and more like a burden being shared. Yet the monarch also knew the palace could not keep this quiet forever. Too many files had moved. Too many people had seen the witness list. Too many silences had become noticeable. William left the room carrying more than responsibility. He carried the knowledge that his children had been shielded by a decision that would deepen his brother's pain. Inside, the monarchy had chosen restraint. Outside, the public was about to turn one private decision into a national spectacle. By morning, the secret was no longer secret. Britain woke to a front page that felt less like news and more like a verdict. The headline stretched across the paper in black letters. Sussex Trust sent to Wales children. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered in the rain, some defending Charles, others accusing him of cutting Harry out with surgical precision. The monarchy had gone public without saying a word. William saw the front page before the palace statement was ready. The prince understood instantly that the story had escaped the quiet language of estate planning and entered the louder world of judgment. A front page is the main cover of a newspaper where the biggest story of the day is placed for the public to see first, and this one turned a private decision into a national argument. The trust redirection now looked bigger than family money. It looked like a public sign that the future belonged firmly to his children. Charles heard the first broadcast summary in silence. The king listened as one broadcaster called it the clearest sign yet that the royal line is being secured around William's children. A broadcaster is a presenter or media outlet that delivers news to television, radio, or online audiences, and this voice repeated the palace phrase future safeguarding again and again. The words made people wonder what danger had been serious enough to move the trust. The monarch knew that phrase would protect the decision, but it would not protect Harry from humiliation. Harry's supporters called it cruel. William's supporters called it necessary. The country split into 2 emotional camps, and both sides believed they were defending justice. For those standing with the Duke, the redirection felt like a father closing the last door on his younger son. For those standing with the future king, it felt like Charles finally protecting George, Charlotte, and Louis from years of family instability. The crown was no longer an idea. It was a line drawn through one family. Catherine watched the coverage quietly until Charlotte entered the room. The princess turned it off before her daughter could hear the words, because motherhood came before monarchy. In that moment, she knew Charlotte's name was now part of the public storm, and she hated that innocence had been pulled into adult conflict. Catherine wanted the children protected from danger, but also from pride, from bitterness, from learning too early that royal safety can come with someone else's pain. William's photograph became the image of the day. The prince was shown entering Windsor with a fixed expression, and the picture carried more meaning than any statement. Windsor is one of the royal family's most important residences, often tied to duty, history, and private decisions, and his arrival there made the public believe something final had happened inside the family. He looked controlled, but not untouched. Strong, but not victorious. Charles did not answer the shouting. Harry did not receive comfort from the headlines. William did not celebrate the support. Catherine did not allow the children to become trophies in the argument. The crowd could argue, the papers could rage, but the final meaning of the decision belonged to the family left standing inside the palace walls. In the end, the trust fund was never only about money. It was about belief. Charles believed the crown had to survive the wounds of his own family. William believed his children had to be protected without being taught bitterness. Harry believed he had been pushed beyond the gate, and the monarchy, cold as it sometimes seemed, made its final choice. The future would be guarded before the past could break it. Charles carried the sorrow of that choice long after the papers were signed. The king knew the redirection had become a defining royal moment because it turned private family pain into a formal estate decision. An estate decision means an official choice about family, money, property, or inheritance, and this one did more than move funds. It told the world which branch would be protected first. It told Harry that love had not been enough to restore trust. It told William that duty had arrived with a wound attached. William accepted the burden with quiet resolve. The prince knew George, Charlotte, and Louis had emerged as the protected center of the monarchy's future, even without standing before the public. That mattered because their names represented continuity, the steady passing of royal duty from one generation to the next. The future king understood that protection could still feel like loss. His children had been shielded, yes, but the shield had been forged from the fracture between brothers. Harry felt the loss in a way no statement could soften. The Duke was not erased, but his branch was no longer treated as central to the crown's future planning. Crown planning means the private decisions that shape who receives protection, support, and responsibility in the royal family's next chapter. For Harry, that truth cut deeper than the money. It meant the family had stopped planning around his return and started planning around his absence. Charles knew the final emotional truth. The April settlement dinner had ended the old hope, and the secret estate meeting had sealed the new reality. The king had once believed he could keep the bridge standing between both sons, but the bridge had cracked under anger, fear, and mistrust. William inherited the duty to keep the next generation safe. Harry inherited the pain of being moved away from the center. No one walked away untouched. The monarchy chose continuity over reconciliation. It chose children over conflict. It chose duty over sentiment. That was the verdict. Cold but clear. Charles made the choice. William accepted the burden. Harry felt the loss, and the crown stepped forward into a future that looked stronger from the outside and lonelier from within.